My name is Miguel Farias. I'm an associate professor in experimental psychology, but most of my work is in the psychology of religion and spirituality. I'm delighted to be talking to you today about the psychology of supernatural attributions. I'm sad that we are not able to meet face-to-face for obvious reasons, but there will be a Q&A session in which we'll be able to interact at, a more natural way, let's say. So let me start by telling you about the outline, what I'll be talking about. We're going to be starting just by very quickly going through the history of the origins and development of attribution theory, and I suspect that this will be familiar to most of you who are psychologists, and particularly those with a background in social psychology. We'll then move on to focus more specifically on religious and magical attributions and whether these are the same, these are as frequently or not, or made differently. And moving on from that, we'll be looking at the various methods of assessing supernatural attributions. Then I'll be talking something more about the cognitive and neurocognitive mechanisms of supernatural attributions. And finally, at a more provocative level, something which I've come to think about, that we also have our own biases, and these also shape how we have come to structure this literature on supernatural attributions. I will end by giving you a summary of the lecture and suggesting a very short list of readings. So, when we're talking about attribution, what is it that we're talking about? So in this slide, you have a cartoon with two ducks, and one is asking the other duck, maybe you should ask yourself why you're inviting all this duck hunting into your life right now. So what this duck is asking his fellow duck to do is to come up with an attribution. So essentially, to make an attribution is to come up with an explanation for an event. And this is something that we're doing pretty much, constantly throughout our lives. So we're, as Kelly said in the early 70s, we're seeking to explain experiences and events in our lives by attributing causes to them. And this is what it really means to make attributions, to come up with causes for these events. Now, attribution theory starts with Fritz Heider. He's really the grandfather of attribution theory. So back in the late 1950s, he suggested that we come up with these attributions, this explanation of events, not just because we're curious about why people behave in a certain way, but because by making these explanations, we are able to achieve a perception of control over the environment. Now, it's a perception. It's not that you have direct control over their people's behaviors, but by having an idea, having an explanation of why they're doing certain things, this gives a sort of sense that we're able to predict and control how things are going to happen within our social worlds. And as we know, if we're able to predict how things are going to happen, this is more likely to lead to favorable outcomes. So basically, a little scheme of we come up with an explanation, attribution. This allows us to have greater prediction and control over our lives. So there's clear sort of benefits to being able to come up with these explanations. And it's very much this kind of inference. So you're kind of making an inference of how this thing happens, how this behavior of X and Y persons happen, and this allows you to predict what's happening. So this kind of idea that you're making a rational inference led social psychologists to think that actually we're all sort of naive scientists or naive psychologists. We're basically looking at what's happening. So we're observing the world. We're collecting data about how these things happen in a more or less systematic way. And then we're rationally, logically making inferences about our social worlds. And this is what led to the idea of thinking that we're more or less naive scientists. However, this was then challenged by research which suggested that when we're making these attributions, the kind of inference we're making is actually very quick and potentially automatic. And if we're making this in a very quick way, it means that we're susceptible to coming up with these attributions in a biased way. So in the 1970s, the attention of the research shifted to thinking about what kind of mistakes are we actually making when we're doing these attributions. So one of the things that came up in this early research is that we tend to make different kinds of attributions when we're thinking about our own behavior and other people's behavior. So when you're trying to explain someone else's behavior, you tend to think about internal or dispositional attribution. So this person was aggressive towards her partner, for instance, because she's an aggressive person. However, if suddenly I have a fit and I start screaming at someone, it's because the other person made me mad or because I was having a bad day. So right at this point, there are suggestions that there are these clear biases in how we make attributions to our own behavior or other people's behaviors. And Heider, the grandfather of attribution theory, he was the first one to think that there are two major ways of making attributions. One is to think of person or dispositional causes, and the other are situational or contextual cues. So this is very much what led social psychologists to talk about fundamental attribution errors, which was then renamed as the correspondence bias. So basically, we're talking about a bias in making these attributions in which we tend to think about this person's behavior based on a certain disposition, such as a personality trait, when this person's behavior could actually be entirely explained by the situation in which her behavior is happening. Something else which is of relevance to this project that you're interested in applying for is that there are clear variations in dispositional attributions across cultures. So think that most of this research was based on subjects, individuals' attributions in places like North America or Europe. However, you'll be conducting research in Brazil, which many social psychologists would classify as a collectivist country, in which people tend to value more their social networks. And this also has implications for cognition and for how people make attributions. So in a very famous study conducted by Miller in the 1980s, he asked people to come up with explanations either for prosocial or deviant behavior and to explain how this behavior happened. And then he classified these explanations in either dispositional or contextual attributions. And he found out two striking things. The first is that children in the US are making quite a lot more of situational attributions to these situations, while adults tend to come up with much more dispositional, think of trait-like explanations. However, when you look at what participants from India are doing, so even the adults are looking much more at attributions that have to do with the context. So they don't rely so much on these dispositional attributions, but much more on the kind of context, the situation which led a certain individual to either have a prosocial or an aggressive sort of behavior. Now, this has very interesting implications which have been found in a variety of other studies. We tend to make attributions about others and even ourselves. So even how we think about defining ourselves in quite discrepant ways, depending on whether you're in a more individualist or a more collectivist culture. Something else which is of interest to psychologists, but also to psychologists of religion, is to think about what is actually causing this correspondence bias. So some of these reasons are motivational. So think of the need for control. We're coming up with these dispositional explanations because, as I have already highlighted, this enhances our sense of predictability. Another reason in which makes us be biased is because we also tend to like to think that the world is fair, particularly towards us. So this is the so-called just world hypothesis, which is another cognitive bias. However, by thinking that the world is fair towards us, it enhances our sense of self-esteem. Now, the other reason why people come up with these biases may simply be because they are a byproduct of misapplying rational principles of inference. And the idea that we have these natural cognitive biases when coming up with explanations about the world is, as I'll talk about later, a key explanation of religious thinking in the cognitive science of religion. So this was really just a snippet, just a brief overview of attribution theory within social and experimental social psychology. But as you will see, this is very important when it comes to trying to understand religious and magical attributions, which I will be talking about next. Surprisingly, when it comes to the psychology of supernatural attributions, it took a while for psychologists of religion to become interested in how is it that religious individuals come up with explanations for other people's behaviors or events in their lives. And it is somewhat surprising because, as we know, religion is just broadly understood as a meaning system. And a system of meanings naturally is there to allow us to make a whole range of interpretations about what happens in our lives. So I'm going to focus on a key paper which was written by Spilka, Shaver, and Kirkpatrick in 1985. I mean, all of them are key figures in the psychology of religion. And they turned out what they call the general attribution theory to the psychology of religion based on the literature that I've just reviewed. So the general literature on attribution theory. So they started out by thinking that, so look at this. So we have these systems, very sophisticated systems of religious ideas, and they tend to be comprehensive and well integrated, and they emphasize the orderliness of the universe. So there is an order, there is a structure to the universe. And finally, they portray the world as ultimately just and fair. So it's not just arbitrary. So all of these characteristics that these religious systems of meaning are comprehensive, they emphasize how orderly and structured and fair the universe ultimately is, naturally predisposes religious people to make all kinds of religious attributions. So they have this model in which they try to differentiate how people either choose to make religious or non-religious, say naturalistic attributions. And this will depend on various things, on who the person is, so what they call the attributor factors. So what are the characteristics of the person and the context of the person making the attributions? And then they also look at the factors within the events. What are the characteristics of these events and the context? So their basic suggestion is that when it comes to coming up with a psychological approach to religious attributions, we need to be able to explain when a religious individual is coming up with a religious versus a naturalistic explanation at a certain point. And as I was saying, they think that this has to do with the availability of either a religious or a naturalistic belief system. And this will be the product of these categories that I mentioned. So the attributor, the attributor's context, the event, and the event's context. Now, growing up in the 21st or 20th and 21st century, we have grown up, in a largely secularized world. So naturalistic explanations will be available for us. On the other hand, growing up within religious families and then engaging in regular religious practices and ideas will naturally make religious attributions quite available. So how is it that the religious individual, at which point will this religious individual make a religious versus a naturalistic attribution? So their way of looking at this, their key hypothesis, is that this will be determined by the dispositional characteristics of the individual in relation to how available at that moment the religious or naturalistic, meaning belief systems, will be. Also, it will also be related to the beliefs about the efficacy of the religious or naturalistic mechanisms for controlling events. And finally, the relative importance of religious and naturalistic sources of self-esteem. So this last element clearly has to do with a motivational component. The first one is more cognitive. It has to be how available this explanation is to these individuals. And the second one is again motivational. It has to do with the level of efficacy of these explanations for controlling events. So the question is, this is really, really interesting, but what they proposed was a model for religious attributions. Now, when it comes to testing how often religious people make these attributions, what we have found out, and note that this research is all coming from the US. But even in the US, with very religious people, what researchers found out is that even these very highly religious individuals tend to use much more naturalistic explanations in their everyday lives. What they also found is that God's actions tend to be seen as a distant and not a proximal cause for what happens in lives. There are, however, exceptions to these. For instance, people will tend to think much more of religious attributions when they are facing life-threatening situations, particularly being seriously ill. So overall, I'm sorry to say that the majority of studies have not supported this model, this hypothesis that religious people, because of the availability and salience of their religious belief system, will tend to use religious attributions. However, there is a whole other set of studies which tend to focus not necessarily on religious, but other types of supernatural attributions, which are often referred to as magical. Now, this was first brought out by anthropologists when they were studying small cultures, particularly indigenous cultures. So Malinowski, for instance, has famously reported that within people living in these islands, Trobriand Islanders, they tended to resort to magical practices and attributions when they had to fish in the sea, which was a high-risk activity. However, they didn't really care about coming up with magical rites or explanations when they were fishing in calm lagoons when the risk was very, very low. He also found out that religious practices and explanations only tended to happen when they were life or death events. So he was one of the first people to highlight that magical rites and attributions were seen as being much more efficacious than religious ones. So people would tend to make these magical rites and think of stuff magically when they wanted to have a higher control over what was happening in their environment. And this has also been highlighted by historians of religion like Keith Thomas, who looked at the decline of magic in Protestant countries. And what he highlighted is that when making a prayer, so when we're asking God for something, you can't really control the outcome. It's up to God. However, when you're doing a magical spell, this will only go wrong if you're doing the spell in the wrong way. And other researchers, particularly philosophers of science, have also come up with an endorsement of this. So they think that religion gives the universe free will. So it's up to God, really, for things to happen or not to happen. While magic, which they think it's similar to science in this respect, they view the universe as much more predictable and allowing us to manipulate it in a way that religion does not. So this is just to give you really an idea of the background to supernatural attributions and differentiation between making religious and magical attributions. I'll be talking some more about that in the next section of my talk, where I will be focusing on the variety of methods that we have used to study supernatural attributions. When it comes to studying attributions, there's a whole variety of methods. I mean, in that sense, what psychologists of religion have been doing is just using everything that is available, both from social psychology, personality psychology, but also the neurocognitive sciences. But let's start with what has been most often used for various reasons. So you're trying to directly infer what is it that people are coming up with. So vignettes have been the most often used to try to understand the explanations people use for events. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them is something that I used for my own doctorate thesis, and I was trying to understand how different kinds of religious people, so for instance, either church-going Christians or people who are more interested in New Age spirituality, how different are their explanations about events in their lives. So something really simple like this. The vignette is, you meet someone for the first time, but that person seems extremely familiar to you as if you had met somewhere before. And then the participant is asked, if this happened to you, how would you explain it? And it's the kind of situation that has happened to most of us. We kind of, that person looks vaguely familiar. So why does that person look vaguely familiar? So there's three basic kinds of explanation one can come up with. One is just a naturalistic explanation. So you're basically thinking of a causality, which is attributed to natural processes, which is, well, perhaps I have actually seen that person on the TV, or it reminds me of someone I know, or it may actually be someone that I've met, but I've forgotten. So perfectly plain naturalistic attributions. Then there's magical attributions, which can be quite colorful and rich. They can be attributed to extrasensorial processes, energies, past lives. I mean, so for instance, I know this person because we've met in a past life, or perhaps our energies are similar, or we resonate in a different way. Or something like, this person has an answer to any of my current life quests. And then when we think of religious attributions, the most common ones would be that, oh, perhaps God wanted me to meet this person and I can do something to help this person. So what we verified in this study was very much what the other research in the United States come up with. So actually, even for the practicing Catholics, the religious attributions are very, very low. Overall, across these groups, people tend to come up with naturalistic attributions above all. However, do notice that for people who are into New Age spirituality, they do come up with quite a lot of magical attributions. And this is very characteristic of people who are interested in spirituality, that they will try, quite often to see signs of why certain things are happening in their lives. You will be familiar with the motto that nothing happens by chance, which quite a lot of spiritual people like to think in those terms. And that will, of course, heighten their process of finding this kind of magical attribution in their lives. Another way of looking at this has been particularly used by anthropologists. I'm very fond of the first book Tanya Lerman wrote, which was the result of her Ph.D. work in Cambridge in England. So for her doctorate, she was looking at neo-pagan groups. So again, so we can call these magical groups, but they're particularly interested in pagan spirituality. So they would meet in groups, and it's very much based on magical ideas. And they highlight that it's really important to learn to see patterns in events. So her basic idea or hypothesis, which she verified, is that magical thinking is not just a result of a cognitive bias, but it's something which can be learned and enhanced by taking part in certain groups, such as the neo-pagan groups she was looking at. And what's particularly interesting about her work, her ethnographic work, so she was doing participant observation, and by taking part in these groups, listening to their explanations of the world and reading the literature they were reading, I mean, she herself started to acquire this disposition to make magical attributions, which at a certain point she said this was happening in an uncritical way, I mean, in a childlike way. So one day she gives the example that she woke up after reading a magical novel on King Arthur, so the sort of mythical King Arthur and the Excalibur. So she woke up and she saw 6 druids on the outside of her window, and she saw this, she says, as clearly as I see my desk. So she's alerting us to the possibility that this process of seeing magical patterns in life becomes so vivid that you start having this kind of hallucinatory process. Now, something which has also been used for quite a while have been questionnaires, and particularly personality questionnaires. As we know, magical thinking is something which happens in schizotypal individuals and even psychotic individuals. So it's one of the characteristics of psychotic thinking. So some people claim that they have extrasensory abilities like communicating telepathically, and they also tend to think that certain things happen because they're caused by mysterious forces. So clearly magical attributions, and these have been measured by personality scales like the magical ideation scale or the schizotypy personality scales. One other way in which magical attributions have been measured have been by the use of perceptual tasks. This hasn't been used often, but occasionally in cognitive and personality psychology. Here I refer to 2 studies that I conducted. So in the first one, I had a random dot screen. So there were these dots which appeared for about 4 seconds, and they kept changing. And I would tell participants that half of these dots had embedded patterns in them, and I asked them to try to see what is it that was happening in those patterns, and the other half was just random visual stuff. And it's really, really interesting how some people would come up with lots of explanations of what they were seeing. So there's some people would see in something, as the image is showing, they would see angels dancing, for instance. In another study, there were actually clear patterns embedded in visual noise. And again, what we realize through these cognitive perceptual tasks is that some people do have a natural disposition to make quite a lot more of attributions to when there is simply random dots or nothing significant, so a random image. Something which has become a sort of trademark of cognitive science of religion has been the use of vignettes with an added task, usually a recall task. So you give people a vignette to read, and then you give them a series of questions, or you're asking them to recall what was happening in that vignette. So one very famous study by Justin Barrett, who is, as you know, one of the founding people of the cognitive science of religion movement, he did it as part of his Ph.D. and he published it in 1996. So he had a series of vignettes, and I will read to you this one. One day, while God was helping an angel work on a crossword puzzle, a woman in South America got lost in a large, dense forest. It was hot and humid, with insects buzzing about wildly. Only thin rays of light trickled to the fungus-covered forest floor. She was terribly afraid that she would not get out, and so she prayed to God for help. God comforted her and showed her a path which led between two hills around a small lake and out of the forest. God helped the angel finish the crossword puzzle. So we had a series of vignettes like this one, and then there was a recall task with questions, which simply asked participants to say whether this was false or true. So questions like: the woman was in a jungle, the path led between two hills, God was working on a crossword puzzle. So these were the general questions. What he was interested in, though, were instances where people would make anthropomorphic inferences. So, for instance, he asked people, God stopped helping an angel work on a crossword puzzle to help the woman. So the correct answer, according to him, would be no, because God doesn't need to stop doing one thing to do another thing. And another of these trick questions to try to spot an anthropomorphic supernatural attribution was: after answering the woman's prayer, God finished helping the angel on the crossword puzzle. And the right answer would be no, because this again has a sense of sequence, and God is omnipresent, so he doesn't need to do one thing after the other. He can do everything at the same time. And what he found in the study was that religious people showed clear biases to make these anthropomorphic inferences. So the next section of my talk will still mention some of the different techniques, but we're going to be focusing more on neurocognitive mechanisms of these supernatural attributions. I am sure that you're all familiar with some of the principles of cognitive science of religion. So the two major players are Stuart Guthrie, an anthropologist. In a way, he predates the cognitive science of religion movement, which will capture inspiration from some of his work, particularly his work on anthropomorphism. Justin Barrett views Stuart Guthrie as a kind of intellectual hero because he gets particularly excited with his idea that our tendency to anthropomorphize, it's a kind of basic perceptual cognitive bias, and that we will use this bias to all novel or ambiguous objects at first, which means that in relation to God, although there are these ideas we might have about God being omnipresent, omnipotent, undefinable by nature, we will still treat God in an anthropomorphic way, because that's just how our cognitive bias works. And it's only through rather conscious effort that we can avoid this bias. So Barrett has got hold of this idea of Guthrie's anthropomorphism and created a kind of spin-off, which he calls, in a rather wordy name originally, the hypersensitive agency detection device. So this, again, is an innate system that detects ambiguous agency in the environment and anthropomorphizes it. And the idea, of course, is then applied to religious thinking and attributions, that we will see the actions of gods or gods in these ambiguous stimuli in the world. So there's been different kinds of developments within cognitive science of religion. When it concerns attributions, something that has happened starting around 2012 has been an explosion of articles in applying cognitive style, particularly dualistic cognitive styles, to how religious people think. And as you know, I mean, it's been a very successful way of dividing two major forms of thinking within cognitive psychology, and this has also been applied to behavioral economics. And particularly someone like Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, in part for this work on rational or logical and intuitive or experiential thinking. So the idea being that our first system of processing information is intuitive and automatic. So very much like the cognitive biases that CSR is relating to. The other one, which evolutionarily came later, is analytical and logical, but naturally being conscious, and it's much slower. So this would be the system that would allow us to step back from the cognitive biases or intuitions of seeing particular human attributes in ambiguous stimuli. So one of the most fascinating papers, and which then gave rise to, various other papers, has been by Gervais and Orenzayan, where they suggested, by using various primes, that when you prime people to think analytically, this will promote a lowering of religious belief. So again, looking at this the other way, the suggestion is that religious people tend to think more intuitively, and that may be a primary reason for why they believe in God and make religious attributions. An even more fascinating study was by Linderman and colleagues in 2013, in which she created a series of attribution stimuli, vignettes, and by using fMRI, they found out that when people repressed the tendency to see supernatural stimuli, this was associated with a stronger activation of the right inferior frontal gyrus. So here we have the right inferior frontal gyrus. And what we know of other studies is that this is a structure which processes our ability to withhold our impulses. So for instance, people who end up in jail have a low ability to inhibit impulsivity and aggression, right? Which would be mediated by the role of the right inferior frontal gyrus. So again, the neural hypothesis, the neurocognitive hypothesis, is that the stronger is your activation of this area of the brain, the higher your ability to repress your intuitive thinking. So just to give you first, before we move into that in more detail, just to give you an idea of the series of vignettes that Lindemann used. So she tried to find a variety of relevant life events. Very, very short, because keep in mind that these were being screened in the fMRI. So, for instance, you have a story, a short vignette. After a gruesome breakup, you are getting back together and you are afraid how the relationship will turn out. Then you are given a visual stimuli, a picture, which will bear some resemblance to how the outcome of this story might be. And then you have a rating scale asking you whether you think that this picture contains a sign or a message about how the situation will turn out. So a sign or a message should be read as a supernatural sign or message. Just to give you a couple of other vignettes. So another one is, a loved one has been arrested for drunk driving and you are afraid he or she will get a prison sentence. And then after the vignette, you see the picture of a wall. And then you're asked, do you see a sign in how the situation will turn out? Another one related to a serious illness. You have discovered a strange skin change on your arm and you do not know what it is. And then you're given this image which gives you a sort of intuition that something bad might happen, that you may have cancer. And again, you're asked if this picture contains a sign, so supernatural. It's the implicit idea, sign or message about how the situation will turn out. And then you're given the rating scale. So, if religion is based on an innate cognitive bias, as cognitive science of religion suggests, how can we explain non-belief? So people who do not believe in God or gods. So either skeptical individuals do not have the propensity to believe in the supernatural, which is not what CSR is proposing, or they inhibit this tendency, which is what Lindemann's study suggests, and which is also what cognitive scientists of religion, like Justin Barrett, will suggest. The title of one of his books is Born Believers. So again, the idea would be that those who do not believe were simply able to develop cognitive strategies to inhibit the bias or intuition. So now I'm going to talk more specifically about how can we come about and test this. So I had read this literature. I was seeing the development of the literature on studies like Gervais and Aranzayan. And we thought of just testing this possibility in a more causal way. So how did we go about doing this? You're probably all familiar with Persinger, the Canadian neuroscientist Persinger studies on brain stimulation and religion. And if you still haven't watched, there is this wonderful documentary where he kind of tries to brain zap Richard Dawkins' limbic system to see if he has some kind of religious experience. I won't tell you the outcome. Just have a look at it. The link is there. So what we went about doing was to test this possibility of that by stimulating the right inferior frontal gyrus, you kind of stimulate more the possibility of walking away from the cognitive bias, and this would reduce the level of your supernatural attributions. To do this, we used electric stimulation, more specifically transcranial direct current stimulation, a machine you are seeing there. So the idea is that if supernatural attributions are indeed intuitive, as cognitive science of religion suggests, and it's modulated by this area of the brain, the right inferior frontal gyrus, so we'd expect that by applying stimulation to this area, participants would decrease their supernatural attributions when comparing this to placebo stimulation, which this machine allows us to do. So how can we assess this? So first we have to control that this stimulation is indeed having an effect on the right inferior frontal gyrus. And there's various cognitive tasks that are used typically to measure the level of response inhibition, which is associated with an increase of activity in this area. On the other hand, we of course wanted to use the supernatural attribution task created by Lindemann, and we also use the typical cognitive reflection test, which measures intuitive and analytical thinking. To make this more interesting, we use the double-blind procedure, which means that neither the participants nor the experimenters knew when we were applying either the real electrical stimulation to the right inferior frontal gyrus or the placebo or sham one. So very quickly, running through the important results. So first, what we found is that the stimulation did work. So we found out that there was a significant difference before people were being stimulated to before the stimulation session and during the stimulation. So we also found out that there was a difference between the people who were actually being stimulated and the ones that only had the placebo. So far so good. We know that the right inferior frontal gyrus is being particularly activated for those in the stimulation condition of the experiment. However, the successful stimulation of this area of the brain did not decrease supernatural attributions. So we could not verify in a more causal way Lindemann's correlational study. We also found out that there was no association between baseline measures of supernatural belief or attributions and intuitive thinking, as measured by the cognitive reflection task, which is what people like Gervainer and Zion have used. More recently, there's also cross-cultural studies that have found no association between intuitive thinking and religious attributions or belief, and various other attempts to replicate the original studies on dual processing thinking and religious beliefs and attributions have simply failed. So this leads me to the last part of our talk, which is perhaps scientists are thinking in a peculiar, weird way, meaning Western educated, rich, democratic countries, when using these cognitive biases to explain the origin of supernatural attributions. Is this a possibility? So when it comes to the potential biases of scientists in the way they look at this, my first intuition, let's call it intuition, into this was when I visited some rock art paintings, figures. There wasn't any paint left, and it's unclear whether they were painted because they were not in caves. They had been etched in the rock, but there's hundreds and hundreds of these figures, throughout an area of over 100 kilometers. So these were found in the northeastern part of Portugal, in the Coa region, only in the late 1980s. And when I visited some of them and the museum, I was somewhat surprised. I thought, so these have been out in the open air for quite a long time. Archaeologists have been doing work in this area and around this area for over 100 years. So how come this was only found in the late 1980s? And the surprising answer of the archaeologists was that the archaeologists, before a certain time, they simply would not perceive these etchings as something meaningful. So they would just think that they were either natural rock formations or some insignificant doodles. So now when we look at this, we instantly recognize them as rock art, Paleolithic rock art. So there is a whole process of education to actually be able to recognize that these have been sketched by human beings about 15,000, 20,000 years ago, right? Okay, so this was just my first intuition that it's something as obvious as human drawings do not come about obviously. There is a process of education. Another insight I had about potential cognitive biases of, again, also of archaeologists, comes from a recent work of Emmanuel Honoré, a French archaeologist who was studying something which, again, has only been found 20 years ago in Libya, the Wadi, I think it is Libya, which is called the Wadi Sura second one. What's really interesting about this is that there is a huge panel with these human hands. You can see the larger human hand, and it's a really simple process where you just put the hand and then you apply the paint to create a kind of stiletto of your hand. Now, if you look at the smaller circle, what archaeologists found was that there was a smaller hand embedded within the larger hand. This was not always, but there were lots of these smaller hands within. And the first papers that looked into this simply reported that, oh, look, how cute. The adults, after having their own hands inscribed on this rock, they then got hold of their small children and put their hands there. So what Emmanuel Honoré did was something somewhat surprising that her colleagues didn't think of doing. She measured all those smaller hands and compared them to newborn baby hands, which were the ones that matched the size more clearly. However, although, roughly speaking, they were of the same general size, clearly anatomically, they were not human hands. So she then thought, okay, if these are not human hands, what are they? So she went around looking at what kind of animal-like hands that had some resemblance to baby human hands might actually be inscribed there. And after going through some lizard, she found a particular lizard which was no longer there in the region, but they knew from fossils that they were very prevalent at the time of these inscriptions. So the bias I'm trying to point out was that the first thought of scientists, who are trained people looking at this is, look, the adults just put their baby hands there. So actually, that was wrong, and it was the archaeologists' tendency to anthropomorphize, to think that these people 10,000 years ago thought like us, because they think that, it's cute to have our baby hands within our bigger adult hands. However, what Emmanuel Honoré is suggesting, it's something completely different. Actually, the potential reason for having inscribed these lizard hands there is because of magical ideas. The idea that these lizards possess certain magical characteristics, and it's important for us to try to understand and perhaps acquire some of these characteristics in a magical-like way. My third example comes from a fascinating work by Daniel Everett, who lived amongst a Brazilian small community of the Pirahã. There's about 300 of them left living in the Amazon. And he went there to study their language and discovered lots of interesting, fascinating things in terms of not just how they perceive the world, but the way their numerical system is different from ours, the way they orient themselves. Now, a question which is salient for this project is whether this hyperactive agency detection device can actually be verified in an urban and non-weird context, such as in the Amazon jungle with people who have grown up there. So if you think of how our parents educated us in terms of threat, the major things that threaten us, like cars, is something which doesn't make much sense for people who are growing up in the middle of the Amazon, in which they have to look out for completely different dangers. And they also learn how to orient themselves in a jungle, which for us is, like landing on a different planet. So Daniel Everett, amongst the various insights, there is a wonderful, very insightful passage where he's walking out with this teenager from the Pirahã tribe. And, he was chatting and it was dark. And suddenly, this teenager says, "Stop, look at the caiman." Caiman being a kind of crocodile they have there, less aggressive, but still, a threat, a clear threat. "Look at the caiman up ahead." So he directs his flashlight and he doesn't see anything. And the teenagers tell him, no, just switch off that thing. That's not helpful. You have to look in the dark because his eyes will just be bright in the dark. So the teenager is pointing at where this animal is and he sees absolutely nothing. There's nothing ahead. It's just, completely dark. So the teenager starts giggling and he moves out, catches this animal, kills it with his bare hands and brings it up to Daniel Everett. He's a linguist. So Everett concludes, urban folks like me look for cars, bicycles, and pedestrians in the path, not prehistoric reptiles. Now, what are the implications of this for something like Justin Barrett's idea of this hyperactive agency detection device? So Justin Barrett has never been in a tropical jungle like the Amazon, right? So he grew up in an urban context, and he has this idea that, oh yes, people 10, 20, 30, 100,000 years ago, they just saw these ambiguous stimuli in the jungle, in nature, and they either saw gods or devils, whatever, in it. However, what this story is telling us is something completely different. That these people, in the dark, can precisely tease out what might be a threat. So there's really no anthropomorphizing or ambiguity, within this kind of environment, when you grow up in this environment. My last example was actually given to me by the historian of science and religion, John Brooks. And it comes up in one of Darwin's books, The Descent of Man, in which he says that one summer day, so Darwin is with his dog, and one summer day, the dog suddenly starts barking at the parasol which is swaying in the breeze. So Darwin's assumption, might I say Darwin's attribution, was that the dog must have thought to himself that movement without any apparent cause indicated the presence of some strange living agent, and that no stranger had a right to be on his territory. So basically, Darwin is making an anthropomorphic kind of attribution to his dog, that he's seeing some kind of living agents because he presumes that the parasol is being moved by someone, either an animal or a human agent. Now, so we don't know what the dog thought, but it's very, very clear that what Darwin is doing is a clear anthropomorphic attribution, isn't it? And he probably in his mind, he's thinking of the anthropological works on magical thinking that had been published about his time. So he's thinking, oh yes, perhaps my dog is thinking like people within a so-called primitive culture are thinking. So I think this is probably incorrect, that the reason for the dog acting like that might be something completely different. It was Darwin himself was making an anthropomorphic attribution, not his dog. Thank you for listening so far. So it's come the time just to summarize what I've been talking about. So starting with the development of attribution theory, the idea is that psychologists developed these ideas to understand the ways in which general people try to explain events in their lives, particularly the behaviors of other people. But they soon realized that these attributions were affected by cognitive biases, and perhaps for good reasons in terms of motivation, such as to enhance our self-esteem, but also to have a greater, at least the possibility of a greater sense of predictability in the environment about what's happening around us. They also noticed that these attributions vary cross-culturally. So psychologists of religion started thinking of how this might apply to religious thinking. And their basic assumption was that, so if there is these rich meaning systems which allows individuals to interpret a whole range of life events in supernatural terms rather than naturalistic ones. So it would make sense that religious people would tend to make more religious than naturalistic attributions. However, the opposite was found in research during the 1990s. Religious people generally tend to make quite a lot more naturalistic than supernatural attributions, except when they're faced with life-threatening situations. However, psychologists also found out that other kinds of non-religious supernatural attributions, such as to fate, luck, or magical forces, were much more common than attributions to God. And further, anthropologists and historians emphasize that perhaps magical attributions are more interesting because they're believed to be more efficient as a means of controlling one's environment. So we've also talked about the wide variety of methods that have been used to study attributions, from vignettes, ethnography, questionnaires, perceptual tasks, down to fMRI and brain stimulation. Now, the conclusion overall from these attribution studies to the supernatural arena has been ambivalent or even contradictory. For example, the tendency to make supernatural magical attributions can either be seen as a personality disposition or a learned process. So the jury is still out. Now, something interesting which has happened with the development of cognitive science of religion is that it has brought again the focus on cognitive biases and suggested that supernatural attribution simply sprang from these biases. And a particular, rich example is how we seek for agency in the environment and we seem to anthropomorphize ambiguous events. And this cognitive disposition to anthropomorphize or to just seek agency is very difficult to repress. Now, various studies from the past 8 years have tried to verify the intuitive basis of supernatural attributions, particularly by relying on dual processing models, which highlighted analytical versus intuitive thinking. Now, despite various successful experimental attempts, including the fMRI study by Lindemann I mentioned, more recent studies haven't been able to confirm the intuitive character of these supernatural attributions, either across cultures or by using neuroscience techniques. So it's likely that what these studies have found was driven by cultural artifacts. Now, this is only one lecture. We could have given 10 lectures on this topic. Just to mention briefly something which was left out. Particularly, there is a growing literature on conspiracy theories, and some of these conspiracy theories clearly have a supernatural attribution edge to it. And it's also been found out that when people are in situations of greater uncertainty or individuals belong to certain groups that are more powerless, they tend to make more of these conspiracy attributions. A final detail which was left out, but it is important, particularly if you're going to develop projects in this area. So keep in mind that attributions are not necessarily an either-or process. So it's not like that early model of religious attributions worked out. It's not that we either make a religious or a naturalistic attribution. As a matter of fact, these attributions can co-occur. And anthropologists had already realized that when looking at indigenous small cultures, that it's not that they only gave the magical supernatural attributions. Often they also made naturalistic attributions, coexisting with the other supernatural ones. So lots of good stuff to experiment on. There is really wide gap. Lots of interesting things to explore. So in the key readings, I have highlighted some bits of the literature which have been really fundamental for this. And I've also put the study by Honoré because I think it's just so insightful to point out our potential biases in looking at how attributions happen. Thank you so much. I'm very much looking forward to having that interaction in the Q&A session that we're organizing in July. Bye for now.